The Baltic region just triggered one of the most consequential logistical shifts in Europe, and it all begins with a number, 283 kilometers. That's the total length of Latvia's railway segments connecting directly to Russia, and the country has now moved to dismantle them entirely. According to Latvian infrastructure planners, removing these lines will eliminate over 60% of Russia's logistical access points into the Baltic region almost overnight. At the same time, it will force Moscow to reroute any remaining transport through longer, slower, and more vulnerable corridors. For a military built around large-volume rail logistics, these numbers represent a strategic shock. So the immediate question becomes, how does Russia function when the core infrastructure it relies on simply disappears? Latvia's move is not symbolic. It is a structural alteration of the battlefield, one that directly targets the single most important dependency of the Russian army: rail-based movement. Russian supply doctrine relies heavily on mass transport of ammunition, artillery shells, armored vehicles, fuel, bridging equipment, and spare parts. Almost all of it moves by rail. Trucks are used only for the final leg because Russia's road network cannot support large-scale, long-distance heavy movement without severe bottlenecks. By initiating the removal of the Zilupe line, the main route linking Moscow straight into Latvia's network, Riga is not just disconnecting itself from Russia, it is deleting a strategic pathway that has existed since the Soviet era. And that matters, because the Zilupe line is one of only 3 east-facing rail arteries that Russia could have used to support any rapid military buildup near the Baltic flank. Once it's gone, that buildup becomes exponentially slower, less flexible, and more predictable. The second targeted artery, the Kārsava crossing in the north, uses Russia's 1,520mm gauge, a reminder that the entire Soviet rail system was designed with military needs in mind. These wider gauge tracks were meant to prevent Western trains from entering Soviet territory and to ensure that Moscow could deploy forces rapidly across its western borders. When Latvia removes these tracks, it doesn't just remove the rails, it effectively strips Russia of the technical compatibility needed to move military trains into the region. Rebuilding the lines is not a simple engineering task. Latvia's plan includes excavating the railbed, dismantling bridges, removing signaling systems, and altering the terrain itself. Once complete, any attempt by Russia to restore these lines would require years of work and billions of dollars, an impossible investment during wartime economic contraction. But Latvia's move makes sense only when placed inside the larger regional pattern. From Finland to Poland, almost every NATO country touching Russia has initiated or completed projects that block or restrict Moscow's military access routes. Estonia is a clear example. The Narva railway crossing, once a major link to St. Petersburg, has faced progressive restrictions. Vehicle crossings were shut down, the bridge was reinforced with anti-vehicle barriers, and now full closure of the rail connection at the Koidula point is being evaluated. When combined with Latvia's action, the result is a full east-facing shutdown on the northern half of the Baltic frontier. On paper, this might look like a series of disconnected national decisions, but in practice, it forms a coordinated strategic wall. Russia is being denied entry not by troops, missiles, or sanctions, but by infrastructure withdrawals. And if Russia cannot move heavy equipment into the region, it loses the ability to create a fast, high-pressure military threat against NATO's northeastern flank. The real operational impact becomes clear when analyzing how Russia's logistics perform without rail. Trucks on soft ground move slowly. The Baltic terrain contains marshland, forests, and limited road networks. Under these conditions, Russia's consumption-heavy military, which can burn through thousands of tons of ammunition per day in high-intensity conflict, becomes a logistical liability rather than an advantage. Latvia's decision channels all possible Russian movements into predictable corridors. From a military planning perspective, this is invaluable. If the defending side knows exactly which routes are viable, it can concentrate defensive firepower. Latvian officials have openly stated that this analysis includes integration with NATO systems. Artillery ranges, HIMARS strike zones, anti-tank missile coverage, and drone reconnaissance patterns. The removal of every kilometer of east-facing rail expands the defender's advantage. Because Russia is being forced into narrower routes, the cost of a mistake grows. And these changes do not occur in isolation. Lithuania plays a central role in the southern theater. As the guardian of transit routes to Kaliningrad, Russia's heavily militarized exclave, Lithuania controls the only land-based logistical lifeline Moscow has into that region. On November 21st, Lithuania halted rail transit of Lukoil fuel bound for Kaliningrad. Publicly, this was framed as a business risk decision. Strategically, it represented a deliberate tightening of supply on a region home to more than 1 million people and one of Russia's largest European garrisons. Fuel shortages in Kaliningrad do not only affect civilian transport. They affect energy production, heating in military barracks, emergency services, and generator operations across the region. A region that cannot heat itself cannot maintain readiness. And the pressure increases when considering the Suwałki Corridor. For years, Russia has depended on a combination of rail and road routes across the Baltic states to maintain Kaliningrad's stability. Now, with Latvia cutting rail lines and Estonia preparing similar measures, nearly all remaining supply must pass through a 65-kilometer-wide corridor between Lithuania and Poland. This is NATO's most fortified point. In any crisis, Russia would have no realistic way to force open this route without initiating a direct confrontation with NATO, something its military is currently unprepared for. Meanwhile, another strategic dependency has quietly disappeared beneath Russia's feet: the Baltic electricity network. For decades, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania relied on the Soviet-era BRELL system, meaning Moscow had the technical ability to destabilize their grids. This was not speculation. Russia used energy leverage repeatedly across Eastern Europe, against Ukraine, Moldova, Bulgaria, and others. Cutting power meant cutting political resistance. But the Baltic states spent years preparing for separation. New interconnectors to Finland, Sweden, and Poland were built. Grid stabilization technology was upgraded. And in February 2025, the final phase was completed. The Baltic region disconnected from Russia and synchronized with the European grid. Overnight, Moscow lost its last remaining structural influence over Baltic energy. This shift matters because a region with independent energy and transport infrastructure is significantly harder to coerce. Russia can no longer shut down power stations, slow down rail operations, or impose technical disruptions as a form of pressure. The Baltics have removed every major lever Moscow once relied on. The broader consequence for Russia is strategic isolation. Every removed rail line, every severed power connection, every blocked crossing increases the cost of projecting force westward. Meanwhile, NATO's capabilities in the region continue to expand. Poland's defense budget has reached record levels. Finland's NATO entry has extended the alliance's border with Russia by over 1,300 kilometers. Estonia and Latvia have increased joint exercises. Lithuania is modernizing air defense networks and upgrading kinetic interception systems. Russia, once able to move tens of thousands of troops toward the Baltic states in days, now faces a future where any such movement would take weeks, if possible at all. Kaliningrad, once considered a forward operating stronghold, now appears increasingly like a logistical trap. The more Russia relies on it, the more vulnerable it becomes. And for the first time in decades, Moscow is dealing with structural changes it cannot reverse. You cannot force a NATO country to rebuild rail lines. You cannot intimidate a nation into reconnecting its power grid to Moscow. You cannot blackmail a government into reopening a border crossing. It has legally closed. Force cannot compel infrastructure to return. That reality is what makes Latvia's decision so disruptive. It locks Russia out of the Baltic region's logistical landscape for the foreseeable future. It eliminates the rapid deployment capability Russian generals once counted on, and it represents a blueprint for how smaller states can reshape the strategic environment through slow, methodical, and legally uncontestable actions. The numbers tell the story clearly. 3 Baltic states, 1 synchronized European power grid, 0 Russian-compatible rail lines, a narrow 65-kilometer corridor under NATO control, a shrinking supply route to a militarized exclave cut off from mainland Russia, and a Russian army that cannot function without rail. In geopolitical terms, Latvia didn't simply dismantle a railway. It dismantled an entire regional strategy. And as more infrastructure shifts occur across Northern Europe, the question for Russia is no longer how to maintain influence, but how to cope with losing it. Thank you for watching. We are an independent news channel bringing you fact-driven analysis in a world full of noise. If you want to support real journalism, please like and subscribe. It genuinely helps us continue our work.